All right. Hello, everybody. Good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. So good to see some of our alumni here as well. It is a pleasure for me to welcome Mr. Gaurav Dalmia, who's the chairman of the Dalmia Group Holdings, a holding company for business and financial assets, which invests in private equity, real estate, and public markets. Gaurav is also the founder and chairman of Landmark Holdings, a real estate investment firm, and a member of the governing board of the Institute for New Economic Thinking in New York. He's an op-ed contributor to the Economic Times, the Times of India, and Financial Times. He was also selected as a global leader for tomorrow by the World Economic Forum in 2000. And he received an MBA with Beta Gamma Sigma honors, go figure, from Columbia University. Gaurav, such a pleasure to have you with us, and we are looking forward to hearing from you on your leadership lessons, things that you've learned over the years, and welcome to the GPODS Fellowship.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's 6 p.m. here in India. I don't know which part of the world people are in, I suppose, in different parts. And I'll talk for the next hour and a half, if you permit me, on leadership lessons I've learned in the last 30 years in business. And these leadership lessons I've found have come from all sorts of places. They've come from literary sources. They've come from practitioners in business, in government, in NGOs. It comes from people in sports and in the field of adventure. It's come from the present times. It's come from the distant past. It's come from the Renaissance world. It's come from the developing world. It's come from winners and it's come from losers. So it's come from all over the place. By the way, you guys are going to be the establishment or are already a part of the establishment. And this word establishment was actually coined in the 60s by a British journalist called Henry Fanley. And it was at that time a derogatory term because there was cynicism about the so-called establishment not doing what was required to be done for the future of the world. And that cynicism we face even today. More so if you're running a big business, more so if you're in public policy or government, because you're dealing with so much complexity, you're dealing with so much heterogeneity. It's very difficult to find optimal solutions. The 5-year election cycle in democracy doesn't help the cause. It actually confuses issues many times. And many times when I see suboptimal decisions and distortions, it's very clear to me it's not because of lack of information. Is because of the way the incentives are set up. So I just want people to understand that we tend to judge leaders very quickly about how capable they are when really they're reacting to the incentives that they have. My screen share is not working.
We can see the main page of your screen. Yes, I think it's working now.
So the Karnataka State Assembly, on the top of the building, if you see it closely, it says government work is God's work. And I actually believe that government work is one of the most thankless jobs out there. It is indeed God's work. We take God for granted. We take government people for granted. If you do well, by the way, it is expected of you. If you do badly, you're heavily criticized. And in modern media, you'll get trolled like crazy. Think about, for argument's sake, Prime Minister of India. Prime Minister of any country. I'll just take example of Prime Minister of India. He has to have a plan right now to fight climate change. It's staring upon us. At the same time, he has to have a plan to fight UP elections. And there's very little overlap between the two. So look at the range of things that politicians and decision makers at that level have to parallel process. So I'd like for everyone to treat politicians with a little bit more respect than we typically tend to. There's a fantastic book written by Jaswant Singh's son, I forget his name. It's called Campaign Diary. It talks about all the challenges that are faced by politicians when they go out campaigning. So in rural India, somebody loses a cow and his economic prospects suddenly diminish. These are the real world challenges. And it's a very humbling book. I think it's written by Manavendra Singh actually. It's a phenomenal book. I would encourage everyone to read it. My respect for the political community went up a few notches after reading that book. Let me take you next to Toni Morrison. She is one of, or was one of the greatest novelists in America. She died 2 years ago. She won the Pulitzer Prize. She won the Nobel Prize in Literature in the early 90s. And when she was a child, her house was burned down because they couldn't pay their rent. So the landlord came and set fire to parts of their house. These are the experiences people have gone to in our day and age. This is not from 100 years ago. By the way, if you are familiar with the US, you will know that in February, Toni Morrison Day is celebrated in Ohio, which is where she came from. And she famously said, as you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think. I think many leaders are actually today very good followers. They're not necessarily the best leaders. And again, that's the way the game is set up. You pander to your constituents and be a good follower, and you'll naturally be a good leader. In the near term, in the short term, that formula works beautifully. In the long term, I'm not sure that formula works beautifully. In positions of power, whether you're in a multinational or in government or whatever, you have to be an agent of change, not status quo, not incrementalism, but transformation wherever it's needed. And that is a challenge which Toni Morrison is putting forward in front of all of us. Let me take you next to another American called James Freeman Clark. He was an American theologian, and he was very unusual for his times because he challenged the prevailing orthodoxy. He advocated abolition of slavery when slavery was common. He advocated women's rights, and he kind of reinforces what Toni Morrison says about dreaming. A politician thinks about the next election, while the statesman thinks about the next generation. And I think that is the mantra we need to have of being a statesman rather than a mere politician. And by the way, policy decisions have long tails. So I'm sitting in Delhi and we criticize the air pollution, the particle pollution. It's a repeat every year, winter. And if you look at what's going on, it was actually the falling water table in Punjab which forced them to defer seeding of certain crops, which forced them to harvest these crops later, which forced the farmers to burn the residue in colder weather, which is why in the last 20 years, to save the water table, we've managed to screw up the air. So these are complex decisions with long tails. And I do believe we need to be able to think through these if we want to really run the world in a decent manner. Just go back in time when India got independent, socialism was a darling of the intellectuals. That's what we inherited. That's how India's formative years got formed. And it didn't lead us to a very good path. If you look at the change China made in the 70s, Deng Xiaoping said to get rich is glorious. Now that was a complete U-turn from where China was heading before that. And it took 15 or 20 years before China caught the imagination of the rest of the world. By the 90s, China was a mainstream player. And today, it's potentially a dominant player on the world stage. So policies matter. Thinking about the next generation actually matters. Let me take you next to Nelson Mandela. We all know who he is. He was a lawyer in Johannesburg. He joined the African National Congress in '43. He founded the Youth League a year later. He led a defiance campaign in 1952, I think. He was arrested and he was in prison for 27 years, from where he led the freedom movement for Africa. He was released in 1990 because of internal and international pressure. He became the president in 1994. He emphasized reconciliation not revenge. During that time, emphasizing revenge would have been very easy. Chose not to do it. He was in his heart a socialist. He did not impose his socialist views on the country. He declined the second term after such a remarkable victory during the first term. And he says, and this quote has been attributed to Ratan Tata, this quote has been attributed to other people, if you want to walk fast, walk alone. But if you want to walk far, walk together. So sometimes we do need to walk fast, right? And a single man has to take charge, make a decision, and carry on. But more often than not, we have to walk far, and therefore we need to walk together. So if you go back into Nelson Mandela's real life, he appointed de Klerk, his predecessor, as a minister. Okay. The right wing at that time in South Africa called him a communist and a terrorist. The leftists saying he was pandering to the right wing by seeking alignment with the people who had ruled over them. But he navigated because he wanted to walk together. Let me bring you now to Elizabeth Warren. She was the first female US senator from the state of Massachusetts in the US. She was a leading candidate in the presidential primaries in 2019. And she did a lot of work for consumer protection in her career. Now, she says science is the culture of doubt. Religion is a culture of faith. And we need both. We can't live without faith. And doubt is what creates innovation, creates new systems. And I think it's an important lesson. It didn't come from a philosopher, it came from a politician, but nonetheless. Now let's go to an economist. We've heard of John Maynard Keynes. He was Lord John Maynard Keynes, by the way. He was actually trained as a mathematician and became an economist. He challenged the free market mantra after the Great Depression. And almost all of the capitalist world has now adopted his mantra. It was going away a little bit, and then the great financial crisis happened in 2007, and Keynesianism is back. Okay. So he's had a great everlasting impact. And he said the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but escaping from the old ones. So think about IBM, king of the hardware business in the 1980s. And some young kid who dropped out of Harvard shows up selling him software. His name is Bill Gates. They underestimated the value of software because they had been conditioned to understand the value of innovation in hardware. They couldn't give up that old idea. They gave up an opportunity to buy Microsoft a couple of times. They simply licensed software from them. So that's an example from the technology world. Another example from the technology world, if you look at the social media companies that dominate the world today, they are the ones who figured that the game is moving from the laptop or the computer to the mobile phone. So if you can dominate the app business rather than what's sitting on your computer, you'll do well. Again, they had to give up this whole idea that IT works on computers. They had to adopt this new idea that IT works on cell phones. And these were profound changes at that time. Kodak, by the way, and we speak about the Kodak moment in reference to so many different things. Kodak did bet on digital. It's a myth that Kodak lost the digital game without a fight, but they made their bets so tentative that they were setting themselves up to lose. So just understanding a new idea is not good enough. Internalizing a new idea and giving up an old idea is what you need if you want to avoid Kodak moments. Now let me bring you back to India. There was a person who I knew personally who passed away a couple of years ago. His name was Subir Kokar. He was a deputy governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and he became deputy governor at the age of 49, which is one of the youngest. He thereafter left there and joined Brookings, India, as director of research, which is when I got to know him. And it was often said about him that Subir brought a Mumbai perspective, thinking in terms of quarterly timeframes rather than 5-year timeframes to Delhi's economic thinking. So businesses accuse policymakers, bureaucrats, politicians of being too slow, of not having enough skin in the game, no sense of urgency. But he encouraged everyone to think like a businessman. I would encourage you to do the same. Let me take you now to a not so well-known figure in the US called Joseph Overton. He passed away prematurely at the age of 43 in the early 2000s. And he came up with a concept which I find tremendously useful called the Overton Window. So the Overton Window says there is something in the center which society will accept. On both the sides, you will have things which are unthinkable or radical or whatever. And in the middle, you'll have sensible, popular policy. And then on the other side, again, you'll have unthinkable, radical, coming towards acceptable. So you have to play the game where society is ready to accept. If you step out of the Overton window, no matter how good your ideas are, they won't be accepted. And this Overton window is determined by culture, is determined by which era you are in, and so on and so forth. And it moves. You can actually move it, but you have to be sensitive to it. So he said, do not change the world by convincing people what's more accurate or rational. Rationality has its limitations. Show people what is possible and change their views about what is socially acceptable. So, which means move the Overton window. Move something that is unthinkable, radical, or unacceptable to sensible, and then slowly to the popular. Now, if you look at the recent farm laws and the whole criticism of the farm laws, if you wear a pure rational hat, there is a train of thought which would support it. And there's a train of thought that would say that in spite of these being good laws, they were not implemented properly. They fell outside the Overton window of the constituents. Constituents being the farmers, the MLAs and MPs who have to sell these ideas to their constituents and farmers, and so on and so forth. And therefore, there was such a big uproar. As a rational man, I'm sitting in my office and wondering what the hell is going on. It was a live example, I thought, of the Overton window. Let me now take you to a guy who was a US political scientist, sometimes came across as a comedian, and I'll tell you why. He taught at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He came from the realist school of international relations. And he pointed out a very uncomfortable truth about American taxpayers. He says the US taxpayer is happy to pay for national and international security. But for some strange reason, the US taxpayer doesn't want to spend as much money and is not willing to pay as much for better schools or better healthcare. Right? They're happy to see the taxes go to some other country, but not for something in your own backyard. And this paradox, he said, is even more important because the US, because of its unique geography and position, is secure. So why do you need to engage with the rest of the world and spend so much money overseas? Now it's becoming an accepted mantra in US foreign policy. Anyway, so he called US foreign policy Confusionism, as in confusion, not Confucius, but confusion. And his Confusionism reminds us that when we are puzzled by what leaders do, that an obvious explanation is that they are just as confused as we are. Just because they're in positions of leadership doesn't mean they know all the facts. So grant them some leeway. And I think he was talking about US foreign policy, but I would say this is true for all policies in the US or in other countries, because the pressures of limited information the pressures of complexity are on everyone. These decisions are driven by domestic constituents. They're driven by election cycles. And I think if only politicians can step back and not react to the noise of the day, they'll be able to make better decisions. And it is upon us, as you go into positions of power and decision-making in large companies of the world of finance or in policy, to make sure that you don't suffer from Confusionism in your own organization. Let me now take you to Henry Kissinger. As you know, he was Secretary of State in the 70s. He was also National Security Advisor. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Vietnam ceasefire. He opened relations with China. So he caught the China wave early. The word shuttle diplomacy was coined for him because he used to keep traveling to the Middle East and back. He would keep going back and forth and back and forth. So shuttle diplomacy was apparently coined because of his actions. He was infamous in India for supporting Pakistan during the Bangladesh war. And I believe he's the oldest living former US cabinet member today. So he said, each success only buys an admission ticket to a more difficult problem. The point he was making was that the world is far more complex than we think. And it has two implications as far as I'm concerned. One, think game theoretically. Think through how others may react. You're not the only player in a game. Think through how others may react. Therefore, think through second and third order effects. So that's lesson number one that I took away from this. The second is, which I've said earlier, don't overreact to the events of the day or to the pressures of the day, because you'll only create new problems for yourselves. Let me now take you to the world of business. So there's a man called Charlie Munger, you've heard of. He's vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire Hathaway, by the way, is staying away from this bubble-like characteristics in the stock market, sitting on $150 billion of cash and saying, not a good time to play, my boy. Let's just wait. World will give us better opportunities. Now, this requires immense self-discipline as compared to following the cheery consensus of the crowd, as Munger calls it. So Munger says, a lot of people are trying to be brilliant. We are simply trying to be rational. And there's a very big difference. He advocates, and I agree, first principles thinking. Think about, if you're investing in the stock market, for example, think about PE ratio. These things will not go away. These concepts will not go away. If you're thinking in the world of agricultural reform, there'll be some basic things to think about, the first principles. In the downturn of 2007, Berkshire Hathaway bought huge stakes in Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, when they were hurting. But in the run up to 2007, they were sitting on cash just as they are now. So you have the courage to be contrarian if the facts tell you that it's better to be a contrarian, even though there is a cheery consensus sitting on the other side. Now, famously, Berkshire says, we don't invest in technology companies. They're too fast moving, they're ever changing, we can't understand them. They're not saying they don't create wealth. They're simply saying it's outside the circle of competence. However, between 2016 and 2018, Berkshire invested $36 billion in Apple, just one stock. $36 billion for a company that doesn't invest in technology. And the argument at that time was, Apple is no longer a technology company. It is a consumer franchise. And sitting behind it is a lot of technology, innovation, and so on and so forth. But this consumer franchise, we can understand and value and appreciate, and a lot of innovation will happen in the background. Now, let me tell you the results of what's happened with that investment. They've sold about 11 billion of that 36 billion investment. They've got 4 billion of dividend thus far. And the remaining value is 132 billion of the remaining stock. Okay. So be rational, you'll make 132 billion. That's the message. Let me now take you in contrast to Bill Gates, right, who's on the opposite side of the business world, technologist, trying to now reform the world through the Gates Foundation, etc., etc. Now he's, as we know, Harvard's most famous dropout. IBM was trying to buy software from Digital Research, which is a competitor, and Digital Research was acting up. Gave an opening to Microsoft. Microsoft, by the way, didn't have the product. They bought it from somebody else and improved upon it because they didn't have time to create a new product for IBM. Few people realize this. Anyway, today, that Microsoft is worth $2.4 trillion, is the second largest market cap company in the world. In 2005, Gates had given up business and he was at the foundation. He gave a TED talk where he sort of predicted that in case there is a pandemic, the world is not prepared for it. It was a theoretical argument he was making, but he was just going through a scenario and he was thinking through it. And he said, look, we are not prepared. If you ask him about what are the big mistakes Microsoft has made, he would quote two. He said, we missed the transition to mobile. We dominated the PCs. We missed how quickly the world would move towards mobile. And he did not anticipate how antitrust action in the late 90s might affect Microsoft. So he understands that people from outside may not see, but he understands from inside what were the big mistakes he made in catching trends. So he talks about trends. And he says, we overestimate change that will occur in the short term, but we underestimate the change that will happen in the long term because of a particular technology or a trend or whatever it is. And this is human nature. If it's vivid, we think it's happening tomorrow. We'll overestimate it. But if it's happening slowly behind the surface, we'll kind of ignore it until it kind of hits us in the face. And it's an important thing to think about, not just in the world of technology, but in economic trends, demographic trends, in whichever way, any social trend that you can think of. Let me now take you to Lee Kuan Yew, founding president of Singapore. He was born as Harry. A lot of people in Asia got Western names because of the British rule and so on. He was born as Harry. He was prime minister from 1959 to 1990. He helped from Malaysia in 1963. Few people will remember this. And that sought independence from Malaysia in 1965. And that's how Singapore was born. So collectively, when they fought the British, they fought as Malaysia. And then Singapore spun out of Malaysia. And his comment about how to develop a country. A society to be successful must maintain a balance between nurturing excellence, but also encouraging the average to improve. If you only chase excellence, it'll have its limitations. And if you only go after the average and not lead from the front, you'll have laggards. Now, he has tried to not create an elitist society and not create a socialist society. And there's a fine balance somewhere in between, which is what they've tended to do. So if you go to Singapore, government servants get salaries which are benchmarked against multinationals. Very few countries would do that. But Singapore, in order to maintain this balance that he talks about, actually does that. So it's not just rhetoric. They over-invest in infrastructure. So we all go to Singapore. If you just time yourself by the time you land and by the time you get into a car, it's at Changi Airport is probably the shortest lead time. They've overinvested in that infrastructure. They were the first to have air-conditioned subways 25 years ago. The subway is for the poor man. And his argument at that time was, a rich society is not where the average man has a car. A rich society is where a rich man can use the subway. And therefore, we will have air-conditioned subways. Now, let me take you to a great philosophical thinker in Asia, which is Confucius, different from Confusionism that I spoke about earlier. Now, Confucius's worldview is really the basis for East Asian culture, not just in China, but you can say parts of Korea, parts of Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. And he called family as the basis for ideal government. I recently read his book called Analects, and it's just fascinating how much of it from that time you can apply to today. And he says you have to study the past if you want to define the future. And his argument is human behavior is the same, no matter what. And therefore, history rhymes. Circumstances are different, but history is predictable if you can predict human nature. And therefore, to study human nature, you have to study history. This applies to business cycles, it applies to geopolitics, it applies to new technologies, all social constructs. So very useful point of view. Let me take you to a behavioral economist called Cass Sunstein, who wrote the famous book Nudge. And I'd again encourage you guys to read it if you haven't. And he says, emotions can get in the way of truth seeking. People do not process information in a neutral way. We are invested in certain ideas emotionally. And it's very hard to give up those ideas, even though there is staggering evidence that this is not working. Getting off that requires a sense of humility, a sense of open-mindedness, which is very personal, which we all have to do. And I would encourage you to think about this. I think about this all the time. Now let me take you to Jared Diamond. He wrote a book on economic history called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and how societies got formed either through war or through germs, how America invaded, Europeans invaded America. And the local population died, not because the Europeans killed them, because they couldn't deal with the germs that the Europeans brought with them. And Steel, which is industrialization. And it's a Pulitzer Prize winning book. It's absolutely fascinating and absolutely worth reading. And he says political compromise seems to be breaking down today. It could precipitate the rise of dictatorship in our country. Now, he said this before Trump, by the way, much before Trump. Many politicians think of compromise as a loss. They think of the glass half empty rather than the glass half full. And that's driven by ego. Again, compromise looks, what will I say to my constituents? And they get trapped in their hardline positions. And this is very damaging if you want to be an effective leader. Let me now take you to a man called Jonathan Tepperman. He, for a long time, was managing editor of Foreign Affairs. And he wrote a book called The Fix. It is an optimistic view of the world. And he does case studies, I think there are 10 or 12 of them, on how countries have solved some of the hardest problems in their own countries. So, for example, how has Indonesia successfully dealt with Islamist extremists? How has Canada dealt with immigration in a more meaningful way than America is grappling? Why is the South Korean miracle carrying on? And so on and so forth. And he says, the chief provided leadership but the people required accountability. Now, there's this whole concept of servant leadership. And he advocates that all these countries which have managed to tackle hard problems, the leader didn't kind of sit on top and give a diktat. They were humble. They understood the real problem. And they said, we have to solve this problem. We are accountable to our people. And they solved seemingly impossible problems. By the way, in India, I am amazed. We use the word, I'm in power. They rule this state. Now, this is a monarchical and a colonial mindset. They're elected representatives. They serve us. They don't rule us. We as common folk use these words. People in positions of power similarly use these words. That is not a good recipe for accountability. Let me take you to John Cotter, who was a Harvard professor of leadership. And he said something very profound. An effective leader wants to do what he must do and must do what he wants to do. Which means if something is inevitable, a leader will not fight an inevitable cause. He will follow it. But something that he really wants to do, he will build a coalition to do it because he must do it. He can't give it up. This requires both pragmatism and ambition. So you don't give up in some fights, but you do give up in some fights. The next person I want to quote is actually my cousin, Puneet Dalmia. He's 7 years younger than me, but sometimes, younger cousins become your guru. So he's one of those candidates. Now, he told me this, we were having dinner or something in 99. And he said, the world rewards courage more than intellect. Now, if you look at the world of entrepreneurship, it's absolutely true. People who have done the best are not the smartest people in terms of IQ or this or that. They are the people who had the guts to take on an incumbent, who had the guts to leave a cushy job and go hungry for a while, or live with uncertainty for a while, and so on and so forth. And I think in life, not just in the world of entrepreneurship, courage is rewarded more than intellect. Let me now go back to America. Ralph Waldo Emerson, you've heard about. He was an American philosopher, father of the Transcendentalist movement, champion of individualism, and his essays were very hard-hitting and absolutely worth reading. And he said, man is a priest and a scholar, and statesman and producer and soldier. The point I think he was making, that in order to be a man, a successful person, you've got to be versatile. You've sometimes got to be a priest, sometimes a scholar, sometimes a statesman, sometimes a producer, and also sometimes a soldier. If you're only one, you will not be a complete man. And I think it's true no matter what field we're in. Let me now take you to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States. By the way, he won 4 elections. 4-time president. And he said, a smooth sea never made a good sailor. If leadership was easy, it wouldn't be leadership. He led America after the Great Depression. So he went through the most turbulent sea a president could go through. He crafted the New Deal, which is the modern version of liberalism, or the modern version of which is liberalism as we see it today. Okay. So he brought new thinking in turbulent waters and navigated America and the world. Let me now take you to Angela Duckworth. She's a US psychologist. And you have to take a test, which she can give you. It's an online test called the grit scale. How gritty are you? And she says grit is living life like a marathon, not a sprint, because real life is actually a marathon. It's easy to sprint. It's more difficult to run a marathon. Consistency, as they say, is more important than intensity. So in a marathon, you need more consistency. In a sprint, intensity can work. You look at great lives anywhere. Okay. In politics, business, this, that, and the other. And you will find upheavals. And great people have transcended those upheavals. So for example, I'll give you again an example from the world of business. Henry Kravis was working at Bear Stearns, and he decides to leave and start private equity, which is a nascent concept in the 80s. They start a new company called KKR, Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts. 3 people leave. Bear Stearns sues them. I can't remember exactly for what. So now you are here raising money, and you've just been sued by a former employer. Good luck, right? Struggling initial years, Henry Kravis's wife decides to divorce him. So now he's going through a personal issue. But yet he came to define the private equity industry. He's one of the fathers of the private equity industry. I'm just giving this as a story, but you can see this in field after field. Let me bring you to a younger man called Kavin Mittal. He is Sunil Bharti Mittal's son from Airtel. He founded Hike, pivoted that to something called Rush. And he says, solving problems using only rationality is like playing golf with only one club. Now, rationality is a good tool, but it's not the only tool. I think we overemphasize rationality. All breakthroughs challenge orthodoxy in some way. If Dhirubhai Ambani had been rational, there would have been no Reliance. Nobody in his right mind would have dared to create a Reliance the way it is today. If somebody was rational, perhaps Windows, the program that we use, would not have existed. Somebody had to think outside the box, think creatively, think beyond rationality. Steve Jobs would not have had the courage to try and come back into Apple from where he had been fired. Look at the audacity of that. So rationality is a good tool, but let's just use it as one tool. Another person who talks about limitations of rationality is a man called Rory Sutherland. Rory Sutherland is vice chairman of the ad agency Ogilvy in the UK. And he's by temperament a behavioral economist. So he says, poetry is when you make new things familiar and familiar things new. Now, he applies this to the world of marketing all the time because he runs an ad agency. Now think about Nykaa. It's making the familiar new. Cosmetics is not a new industry. Enough cosmetic brands are there sitting within multinationals like P&G and Unilever, right? They take this familiar and make it new. And it's a big hit. $12 billion in market cap. We can argue the market cap is wrong, but to build a 2,000 or 2,200 crore revenue business in 7-8 years with very little capital raised is just fantastic. So Falguni Nair took something which was familiar and made it new. The iPhone, on the other hand, took something new and made it so idiot-proof that it looked very familiar. It was very easy to use. And it was one of the greatest innovations in the world of electronics. So both these you have to do. Sometimes you have to make the familiar new, sometimes you have to make the new familiar. Let me now take you to Eric Liu. He served in the Clinton White House and then in the Obama administration, and he talks about storytelling. Stories are weapons in an endless contest for legitimacy. I think we don't understand facts as easily as we understand stories. And therefore, storytelling should be a required class in college. Certainly a required class for people in leadership positions. Let me give you an example from history that I learned about recently. So we've all heard of Tipu Sultan, ruler of Mysore. His father was a man called Hyder Ali. And Hyder Ali was fighting the East India Company. And the British Navy was trying to help the East India Company and so on and so forth. And Hyder Ali teamed up with the French, because the French hated the Brits, to fight the East India Company and the Brits. Now, at the same time, this is late 1700s, the Americans were seeking independence from the Brits, and the French were helping them as well. So the story travels from India. That's a little ruler called Hyder Ali is taking on the British Empire, the East India Company. And he's reasonably successful. It motivated the Americans. So when the fight between the Americans and the British started, one of their main boats was called Hyder Ali, in recognition of a man they had never met. They had no clue who he was, except he had taken on the British successfully along with the French in India. This is the power of stories. Let me now bring you to the Harvard Negotiation Project. It was started in the late 70s by Harvard Law School. And most decisions, or many decisions, are disguised negotiations. That was their premise. They studied real world problems, and the outcome was a book called Getting to Yes. So if you haven't read it again, I would encourage you to read it. And something very interesting I read when I was reading some of the books on the Harvard Negotiation Project. More often than not, though people's positions may be different, the interests are aligned. So no matter what your situation is, you've got to be able to find those aligned interests. And then deal with where your positions are different, why your positions are different. We tend to believe everything that the opposing side is saying is somehow anti what we want. That's absolutely not true. It makes negotiation easier, more fruitful, faster, etc., etc. Let me bring you to an Italian man called Carlo Cipolla. He's an Italian economic historian, and he wrote an essay in the 70s, which is called The Basic Laws of Human Stupidity. Okay. So I will quote from that. And it says, the probability that a person is being stupid is independent of any other characteristic of that person. So let's say there's a person who we determine is stupid. He may be a smart conversationalist. He may have a good career. He may be materially successful. He may have many traits, but he may yet be stupid. I'm just making a light-hearted comment. So stupidity is more common than you think. That's the. Now let me take you to an adventurer called Robert Swan. He was the first person to walk both the North and the South Poles. And now he's a goodwill ambassador for the UN Environmental Program. And he says the biggest challenge facing the world today is the belief that someone else will save it. Now, this is absolutely true. Whether it's climate change, whether it is inequality, whether it is nuclear proliferation, you name it. We somehow think that a politician or an American leader or the army or some negotiator will go out and change the course of events. It's not true. We all have a role to play, sometimes merely as constituents, sometimes as active participants. So let me give an example. We all believe, let's assume we all believe global warming is a challenge we must address. We may simultaneously believe, what can a common man like you and me do? Let me give you an idea. We know that production of meat is a big source of carbon dioxide. So just being vegetarian 2 days a week, 4 days a week will reduce your own carbon footprint. And if societies as a whole say we will cease to eat meat 2 days a week, it'll reduce the world's carbon footprint. So we are individually not as helpless as we might sometimes believe. I think that's a very important message from Robertson. Now let me take you to Bill Clinton. He was, as we know, the 42nd president of the United States, 1993 to 2001. And he presided over the longest period of peacetime expansion in US history. If a third term was permitted, he would have easily won a third term. Under US law, it's not permitted. In spite of the Monica Lewinsky scandal, he would have won it. That was his popularity. And he said, this is a statement he made during retirement, I want to come back as the bond market. Now, this is the president of the United States who's departing, saying, I want to come back as the bond market. You can intimidate everyone. The takeaway that I have from this is there is interdependency. Even the most powerful man in the world worries about something called the bond market. There's interdependency. The implication is you have to carry people with you, or the bond markets with you, or other stakeholders with you. And the bond market is just a metaphor. So remember, Clinton was scared of the bond market. Let me take you to science, to Marie Curie. She was a Polish woman who was naturalized, as you know, as a French citizen. Was famous for her work in radioactivity, but she was also an astute observer of human affairs. She said, be less curious about people and more curious about ideas. And this people versus ideas is chasing ideas rather than people, or being more curious about ideas rather than people, will make you more objective. It'll help you cut to the chase. And very often, we reject good ideas from people we don't like, or accept bad ideas from people we really like, which we won't do. So we have to learn to distinguish between people and ideas, which I thought was a great takeaway. Now let me quote Alan Kay. He's an American computer scientist. He designed, or was part of the team that designed, the Windows graphical user interface. And he won the Turing Award in the early 2000s. And he says something very simple. A change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points. 80 IQ points, by the way, is a lot. Okay. So instead of just looking at something from here, if you can look at from here and here, just that increases your intelligence or increases the quality of your solution. I saw this firsthand. There's a man in Singapore called Asit Biswas. He has won the Stockholm Water Prize, which I believe is the equivalent to the Nobel Prize in water. And he was advising Coke on how to make their operations water neutral, because Coke is often criticized for sucking up water in rural areas. So one of the case studies he was doing was Punjab. And he said, let's go to Punjab and let's level the land. So at first glance, you look at it and you think, look, we're trying to solve a serious problem here, which is how to make ourselves water neutral. Leveling land seems like some stupid political gimmick. I said, no. You cannot change the concept of flood irrigation that is prevalent in Punjab. People will flood their farms. Changing behavior will take ages. It will take a generation at the minimum. If you have slanting land, water goes away. If you level the land, you will reduce water consumption. And therefore, the net water consumption in your area will fall. Now, what a simple idea. And I believe Coke implemented this and repeated it in many states. So this was just a change of perspective. Everyone was thinking there'll be some high-tech solution. You've got the world's great water expert, Stockholm Water Prize, and God knows what. And he came with a very effective solution. Now let me take you to William McRaven. The US Naval Academy has a very tough regimen for cadets. Very tough, physically, mentally, and so on. Many people want to drop out. And you can drop out. But there's only one way to drop out. At the center of the US Naval Academy, there's a bell. You have to go and ring the bell and you say, I want out. Nobody ever rings the bell, no matter how tough these circumstances are. So Naval Admiral William McRaven says, if you want to change the world, don't ever, ever ring the bell. So if you are in the business of changing the world, your regimen will be as tough as a naval cadet. And if you ring the bell and opt out, you will lose that opportunity forever. I think it's a very inspirational, good inspirational message. Now, let me bring you to a television serial called Yes, Minister, which was a satire, political satire in the 80s. And then it became Yes, Prime Minister, when the minister becomes Prime Minister. And it's a story of his right-hand guy, the bureaucrat. And the bureaucrat's name in the series is Sir Humphrey Appleby. And he's played brilliantly by Nigel Hawthorne. And the character, Sir Humphrey Appleby, is talking. He says, Bernard, if the right people don't have power, do you know what happens? The wrong people get it. Politicians, courts, and even ordinary citizens. So this is a bureaucracy trying to control its turf, but I think it has an important message. Never have a power vacuum, because once you have a power vacuum, all sorts of opportunistic forces come and dominate. And then you have to deal with those opportunist voices rather than logical voices. And we've seen this. In India, sometimes courts have had to come and fill that void. Sometimes bureaucrats have had to come and fill a political void. And then it depends on the individuals, how it plays out. But systematically never have a big void. I think it's a great message as you build organizations that all of us must remember. Let me now take you to a psychologist called Carl Jung. And he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So understanding yourself, what is inside you, what is unconscious, it will show you your strengths, your weaknesses, and your predispositions. It will become like an arm in your hand. And this self-realization, I believe, as you go through higher and higher ranks in an organization, nobody else will tell you the truth. You have to learn this truth by looking inside and understanding yourself and understanding your own predispositions. And if you want to conquer the world, you'll have to conquer yourself. I think this is a very important message. Now, let me bring you to a political philosopher called Friedrich Nietzsche. One of the most politically incorrect people out there, but his views were spot on. He was a German philosopher, as you know, in the 1800s. And he said, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any harm. I think we don't emphasize the why enough. So if you are an underdog in a business, the why becomes more important than the how. If you wonder why terrorist organizations sustain, because they have strong whys. They may not know the hows, but they have strong whys. And I think this is a very important message. Let me tell you a quote from Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller was one of America's great playwrights, and Death of a Salesman was one of his most well-known plays. He was also married to Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe had many marriages, so for a period he was married to Marilyn Monroe. And he said an era can be considered over when its basic illusions have been exhausted. Now think about, we have the Great Depression and so on and so forth. And by the 1940s, socialism is in full bloom. The intellectual current is in love with socialism. That was the era. The free market era had ended. Socialism was in full bloom. Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s, the socialism era had faded. It had outlived. Its illusions had been exhausted. And the free market was coming back. 2007 happens. Okay, or the build up to 2007 happens. A lot of Americans or Western world people find that the standard of living has not improved over a full generation. And we are going back from free markets. So every era has its illusions. Some of them are fulfilled, some of them are not. And we have to therefore recognize that no ism, capitalism, socialism, is permanent. Let me take you to an athlete called Jerzy Gregory, who was, I think he won the world weightlifting championship 4 times. And he says, easy choices, hard life, hard choices, easy life. Now, this is true. We see it in business all the time. We see it in the world of human affairs all the time. Google was a late entrant into the search business. The Yahoos of the world already dominated it. But they said, we have a better formula. We will kill Yahoo. Or we think we can kill Yahoo. We'll find a way. So they didn't make the easy choice by saying we'll sidestep and we'll do this or do that. They just took Yahoo head on. And look at where Google is today. If we make easy life choices, there's no upside because all of us can make easy life choices. It's a commodity. Easy life choices are a commodity. Let me take you to an American author, Mark Twain, who's father of American literature. Now, he said something I may not fully agree with. A man who is a pessimist before the age of 48 knows too much. But if he's an optimist after 48, he knows too little. So my takeaway from this, at least, is you have to be a realist. You don't have to swing from pessimism to optimism. It's easy to be idealist when you're young, when you know too little. It's easy to be a cynic when you're old, when you think you know too much. I think both are wrong. You have to be a realist, not an optimist or a pessimist. Let me now take you to the world of sport again, to Michael Jordan. He's widely considered in America as the greatest basketball player of all time. Yet, the best quote from him that I've heard is about failure. I've missed more than 9,000 shots. This is Michael Jordan speaking. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot, and I've missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life, and that's exactly why I've succeeded. He's not deterred by failures. The misses, the so-called misses that he refers to, he just treats them as noise, and he just carries on and on and on. This is the greatest player, basketball player of all time. Focus on trying, and winning is just a byproduct. Let me take you to a Nobel laureate called Michael Spence. He won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2001, and he's made a living out of studying countries and economies. He said the combination of a workable basic formula and the capacity to improve over time is what one hopes for in any aspect of society. A formula that works, we always kind of understand that we need a formula that works. But to constantly improve it, we kind of miss that second point in life. And I think that's where the real punch is. So if you look at Vietnam, Korea, the Czech Republic, Japan, Mexico, they've all found slightly different formulas, but they've all improved upon their formulas over time. Let me now take you to Mahatma Gandhi, father of modern India. And he said, the enemy is fear. We think it is hate, but it is fear. Now, psychologists will tell you that fear and hate are adjacent emotions. So let's take immigration as an issue. We hate. Take majoritarianism as an issue. We take hate, but really it's fear. Immigrants will take away our jobs. So-and-so will hurt our society in some way, and so on and so forth. You can take this at an individual level. You can take this at an organizational level. Let's think of two companies that compete with each other. They hate each other sometimes, or political parties hate each other sometimes because they fear each other. So the root cause is fear, and we have to rise above this fear if we have to rise above this hate. I think it was a very profound statement. I found it quite by chance. It's not that well known a saying by Mahatma Gandhi. Let's go back to America, and I'll bring you to Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio created Bridgewater Associates, which is, I think, the largest hedge fund in the world today. He started that in the mid-70s, about 150, 160 billion dollars. His own net worth is about 18 or 20 billion dollars. And Bridgewater is known for radical transparency. The corporate culture of Bridgewater is radical transparency. And he says, one of my most overarching principles is knowing how to deal with what you don't know, radical transparency. It's much more important than anything that you know. Overconfidence, psychologists will tell you, is a common trait because we know X, X, Y, Z. We think we know. But focusing on what you don't know, what can surprise you, I think is very, very important. And my takeaway, therefore, is think probabilistically when you make a decision. This could happen, or perhaps this could happen. How might I deal with this part of the decision tree? How might I deal with this part of the decision tree, and so on and so forth. And also be aware of your circle of competence, because you know what are things that you may not know. Now let me take you to Nassim Taleb, who was an options trader turned philosopher. And he says, men destroy each other during war, but they destroy themselves during peacetime. And he makes a simple point. He's saying, we know how people destroy each other during war, but during good times, we become complacent, we fall into petty rivalries, we do all sorts of things that we would never think about during wartime. But why would you do that? So it's good observation on how good times may make us complacent. Similar thought from similar to what the Bridgewater point of view from George Soros. As you know, he was Hungarian born, one of the most famous hedge fund guys out there. And he says, misconceptions play a prominent role in my view of the world. He says that people tend to oversimplify the world. They tend to have blind spots driven by ideology. They generalize too quickly, and they don't have enough of a granular view of the world. And therefore, you have to make sure you don't have these misconceptions. The world keeps changing. And today, by the way, Soros is a 26 billion or some $30 billion hedge fund. No outside money, only insiders' money. These are all employees of Soros. That's it. Their money. That's the wealth they've created for their insiders by just following this. Let me now talk about liberalism, and I will quote Robert Frost, who's an American poet. He says, a liberal is a man too broad-minded to take his own side in a quarrel. I quote this to actually say that liberals have let down the world. The liberal worldview should have really helped the world. Intellectually, I agree with that worldview totally. But empirically, it has let the world down in quite a few different ways. Liberals often don't have tolerance for other points of view, which is absolutely against the liberal point of view to begin with. Liberals have hijacked agendas. They'll go into name calling and all sorts of things. They'll hijack agendas. And Trump is a manifestation of how liberals have let down large sections of society. So I think liberals need to think about, if they truly want to make a better world, and I come from that tribe, how we might do. Let me now quote Azim Premji. He was studying happy at Stanford. His father passed away and left behind a company called Western India Processing. And Wipro, by the way, stands for Western India Processing. A little oil company, which then he came and he built an oil business, and then he built Wipro, the IT services business. By the way, today, his charitable giving is 27 crores a day. Biggest charitable contributions out of India, 27 crores a day. So he says success is achieved twice, once in the mind and second time in the real world. And I think both these steps are important. If you don't have success in your mind, if you don't believe it, if you don't internalize it, if you don't think through how you might achieve success in your mind, you will give up, you will falter in the real world. So it's a mind game. To finish, let me bring you to the world of ideas. This is the quote, this is the motto of the University of Texas, and this is a picture from the University of Texas, which says, what starts here changes the world. I would encourage you to believe that ideas matter. Not just technology, innovation and ideas over there coming out of MIT or now Tsinghua University in China or Stanford or whatever, but even in all social sciences and all aspects of life. As a base case, if you look for ideas, it'll be stimulating. That's the base case. In the best case, some of these ideas will become tools with which you can change the world. So do believe in the power of ideas. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaurav, for this amazing journey of ideas today. Every time I was looking at a slide, I could connect it with so many different things. In fact, interestingly, today I just bought a book on the airport about Leonardo da Vinci, written by a medical doctor, and it was fascinating about to connect a lot of these things, how Da Vinci faced so many failures, but still eventually turned out successful, how he believed in the power of ideas. And a lot of these things that you were talking about, I could really relate to this person's life. So, no, thank you for that.